Hi everyone. Welcome to our first video in this lesson series about learning programming using p5.js. Specifically in this course, we're going to be learning JavaScript, and we're going to be using p5.js, which is a JavaScript library for creative coding, in order to do so. A little bit later on in the series, we're also going to dive into a library called p5.play, which is a game engine for p5.js. We're going to talk about eventually how to build simple games based on the skills we're going to learn in this series. So for this first lesson this week, we're going to break it down into three parts. We're going to start by talking about briefly what is p5.js, introduce you to the editor for p5.js, and just quickly write our very first program. In the second part, we're going to unpack the syntax a little bit more and talk about some of the basic drawing commands. And in the third part for this week, we'll talk about 2D transformations and introduce your first code exercise. So p5.js, like I mentioned, is an open source creative coding library. And the reason we're using it in this course is that A, it's very accessible, it's free. Anybody can use it for free online. It's geared towards artists and designers, and it's a very fun way to learn how to program. It's also based around this sketching metaphor, which really encourages students to write lots of short programs and just gonna quickly try some ideas, put them on screen, and practice programming ideas in these little kind of bite-sized chunks, which I think work very well in the context of learning programming. Um, so this is the website for p5.js, p5js.org. All the links to there are going to be available in the description below. So on the website, and eventually we'll kind of talk about some of the different sections, but we're just going to dive in today and start talking about the online editor for p5.js. There's many other ways that we can write p5.js JavaScript programs. A little bit later on in this series, we're going to maybe talk about Visual Studio Code and how to work offline. But for the first part, we're going to focus on the online editor because it's quick, readily available, and very simple to use. So to get started, you're going to go to the front page of p5.js and open the Start Creating with the p5 Editor link. That's going to take you to a page. You can log in using your Google account, or you can create a free account on the p5.js website. You'll know that you're logged in if your username appears over here. And this will take you to a page that looks like this. On the left here, we're going to have a text editor. We're going to enter in the text of our program. On the right-hand side, this is going to be the preview section where we can see the output of our program. And then at the bottom here below, we have something called the console, which we'll come back to in a minute. Now, before we get started and start writing our first program, we're going to do a little bit of a tour of this interface and kind of highlight some of the important areas. Just to begin with here, I'm going to open the settings, which is the preferences, that little settings icon in the corner. I'm going to change for myself. You do whatever you like. I'm going to change the theme to dark. It's a little bit easier on the eyes. I feel better already. I also made my text size a little bit bigger for just readability purposes, but of course you can leave yours as is. You may also want to consider turning off this autocomplete hinter. So by default, this is on. I suggest turning this off when you're just starting to learn how to program. You can leave it on to see what happens. It will give you some suggestions as you type of what you might want to put in. And I find in the beginning it can get in the way a little bit. So I'm going to just leave mine off, but feel free to leave yours on and see if you enjoy it. So that's it for the kind of the global settings. Okay, so we already talked about the different sections of the interface. Over here, we have a very simple menu. And again, that's why I like to start using the P5 editor just to get students started because it's very accessible and very easy to use. We can create new files, we can save them. By default, when you create a new sketch on the P5 editor, it will give you this randomly generated name. You can change the name of the program by just clicking on it and giving it, I suggest giving your program some meaningful names so that you can find them later on. So for us here, because this is part of a course called Intro to Computational Arts, we'll call this program ICA. And let's go with week 1. We're going to say first steps. Okay, and that's going to be the name of my first program. So always a good idea to give your program a name. Normally the code will autosave, but you can always hit hit save the very first time, right? And once you do, it will say by your username here, and this when you know that your sketch has been properly saved. Okay? All right. Now, otherwise, over here we have a play button, kind of self-explanatory. When you hit play, what happens is that your code will run. You're given here, every program starts with this little boilerplate section of code. We'll dive into what this syntax means, explain all of these in this week's videos. Over here, we can see the preview section has kicked in. You can stop the program by pressing stop. And then this little checkbox here called auto refresh. Now, auto refresh, I suggest leaving that on in the beginning, but again, you can experiment. What this does is that as soon as you make some changes in the code, let's say we go here, it will automatically run the sketch for you. So I suggest, again, leaving it off in the beginning, and then you can experiment with turning it on or off as you need. But as you're getting started, I prefer to just leave it off and then hit the play button a little bit more explicitly when you want to actually run your code. Okay. All right. So that's kind of the brief overview of the interface. We'll dive into some of the rest of these menus in this week's videos. But before we move on, I also want to talk a little bit about what we're doing when we're writing a p5.js sketch, a p5.js program, and just kind of unpack that a little bit. So the first thing that you may notice, of course, is that we are writing this code inside a web browser. I'm using Chrome right now, and I suggest using Chrome as well. Just it's well supported. It's going to give very good results, but this editor should work in other browsers as well. So the first thing to point out is that we are indeed writing a web page, right? We're building a web application, and what we're seeing here on the right, this is the preview of our website that we're developing. It's just that our website is made up of this p5.js script. Now, why this is important? Well, a few reasons. If you look at on the left-hand side of the screen here and click on the arrow, we're going to expand here. These are the files that make up our sketch currently. So one of the services that this editor provides for us is that it will host the web page that we're developing for us, right? So it's being hosted right now at editor.p5js.org. We'll see in a few weeks we can actually write locally on our own computers, right? We don't have to rely on things that are hosted on the web, but every p5.js program that we are going to write is going to have to be executed through a web browser. And the reason why is because JavaScript is a programming language that exists to be embedded within a web browser. So on the left here, we have 3 files that get created when we build a p5.js sketch. This is not something we're going to dive into too much in this course, but it's good to be aware that this is what we're doing. So we have an index.html. If some of you have done web design before or web programming, you may be familiar with HTML. You can open it up here to see what it looks like, and we can see this is the HTML script, kind of tag language to build websites, and this is a template that gets automatically created for us whenever we create a new p5.js sketch. We can see that 2 files are being included. We have the p5.js library itself. We also have the p5 sound add-on that automatically gets included also. Later on in the series, we're going to talk about libraries more broadly. Libraries are basically extensions to p5.js that we can install to add capabilities to what the language can do. So by default, these 2 are included. And then at the bottom here in the body of our web page, we have a link to our sketch.js JavaScript program. Okay? So the sketch appears over here. This is the program that we're editing. And this style sheet is also included. A very basic style sheet here, CSS style, which basically says, no padding, no margin to the body of the web page, and gets the canvas, which is the element that we're going to be working with inside our P5 sketch program to be displayed as a block. Okay. We're not going to dive into CSS and HTML in this course, but it's worth remembering that the program that we write is essentially embedded inside a regular old web page. And what that means is down the road, we can actually create all kinds of HTML elements if we want to, and they can coexist with our P5.js program. It can interact with them and vice versa. So what we're essentially doing is building a web application. Okay? So just something to keep in mind. This is also, by the way, where we're going to add eventually, as we bring in future lessons, assets like files, like images, sounds, and so forth. They're also going to be hosted by the p5.js editor, and we can start to add more files eventually to our programs. But we're going to keep it simple for these first few weeks. So we're going to dive back into our sketch.js here and close that sidebar. Okay, so now that we have this out of the way, which is the fact that we're, under the hood, we have a web page that's running and we're just editing a little portion of it. Let's build our very first p5.js program. Now for this first program, I'm going to kind of hand wave over a few different things, and don't worry if some of the syntax doesn't make sense just yet. In the next video, we're going to start to unpack the syntax in a little bit more detail. But for now, I just want us to just write a quick little program just to demonstrate what is going on here. So the first thing we'll do is we have this line here. So the first thing I want to point out is we have these two sections that you can see. We can collapse them with the arrows. We have something called setup, and we have something called draw. We'll expand on those in coming weeks, but every P5 sketch is going to have those two sections at the beginning. In a nutshell, setup is where we write code that runs once in the beginning, and draw is where we are going to write code that happens over and over. So draw is going to become our main animation loop. Okay. So in setup, we have something called a function. So this line of code here is a function because it has the syntax of a name with some parentheses and then some parameters inside the parentheses. Again, we'll dive into that into more details later. Create canvas, right? 400 by 400. This is what's building our little gray canvas over here. We're going to expand this a little bit just to fill the space available. So instead of 400, I'm going to write window width, and pay attention to the capital W here. Very important. We'll come back to this also as to why. And then window height. Okay, so whatever the width and height of my window that's available, if we hit play, that becomes now the size of our canvas. Fantastic. Inside draw here, we have something called background 220. Now 220 is a gray level right now. In the next video this week, we're going to dive a little bit more into colors and how they work. But instead of the 220 here, we could replace this by there's other ways we can express color in p5.js. For example, I could put a single quote and then just simply name a color. I could say gray, right? Or I could say blue. That's maybe a little bit intense. I'm going to go back to gray for this example. Okay? So we're going to set a gray background, and then we're going to draw a circle. Okay? So let's say we're going to draw a circle. We're going to use the circle function, open a parenthesis, and then we're going to put in what's called parameters to that function. The first two numbers we're going to put in is the coordinate of where we want this circle to appear. So let's say I'm going to put in 200 and 300. These coordinates are in pixels. And in the next video this week, we're going to dissect that in more detail, talk about the coordinates, how this all works. But for now, just remember, this is a coordinate in pixels, so that's going to land like somewhere over here, right? And then the last parameter is the size of the circle. So let's say we're going to draw a circle that is 100 pixel in diameter. And then I'm putting a semicolon over here, just because there was one over there and one over here. So every line of code in our program is going to end with a semicolon. And there's our first circle. So at its core, what p5.js allows us to do is it's a programming library that has a focus on the visual and to some extent the audio as well, the sound. It has a full-fledged kind of sound manipulation component as well, which we'll dive into eventually. And it's a way to learn about programming concepts visually, right? So we can write programs that are going to produce drawings, animations, and all of these are going to happen in the browser. So the circle command is one of those drawing primitives we have access to self-explanatory, draw a circle. And then more importantly, this canvas we have over here is not just a static image. This is actually something that repeats over time. This function called draw here actually behaves as a loop. So once the program starts, draw is just happening over and over all the time. So we can also create animations through code. So let's demonstrate that really quickly. Instead of drawing our circle always in the same location, always at that exact coordinate, we're going to replace these numbers with something called a variable. Next week, we're going to dive really deep into variables. But for this week, we're going to use something called a built-in variable, which is something we have access to without having to do anything. and we will use a variable called mouse x. Important to capitalize the x here, and a variable called mouse y. And I'm sure you can make a wild guess as to what these are going to do for us, right? So you can see now the circle location is changing according to the value of these variables. Now in this case, it's the coordinate that my mouse is pointing to, right? So as I move my mouse, the circle is following my mouse around. Okay? So here it is, our very first p5.js interactive program. Okay? If we wanted to spice things up a little bit, just to kind of show things that we're going to talk about in coming weeks, right? So a fun trick that we can play with is we can move, let's say we move the background to setup, right? Remember, setup is going to happen once in the beginning, and then draw is going to happen over and over. So the background is interesting in p5.js because if you're used to working in the context of, let's say, like Photoshop or Illustrator, right? If you change the background, you're working in this world of layers, and you're just changing the background's going to change to another color. In the world of p5.js, when we build these programmatic animations, think of it more as like you're painting on a canvas, right? That's why it's called a canvas, this metaphor. So when we change the background, it's like we're splashing our canvas with a single color of paint, okay? Erasing everything that's there so that we can start fresh for the next frame of animation. So if we were to say move the background to setup, right? Imagine what's going to happen. We're only going to splash the canvas with gray the very first time the program starts up. And then in draw, we're not going to do this anymore. Okay, I've moved it up into setup. And then if we hit play, this is what happens now, right? So we get this, it looks like, we get this trail of circles because we're no longer splashing the background with gray, erasing the background at the beginning of every frame of rendering of our program. Okay? So this really demonstrates really well, I think, the timing of these two code blocks, right? Setup and draw. Cool. Okay. So we can have animation, right? Right now we're simply just doing some basic interaction of the circle following my mouse. And then just for fun, also, we're going to show that programming is all about creating conditions, branching. Eventually, we'll talk about loops. We'll talk about data structures. But let's do a very quick example of having a decision in our program, doing some branching. And don't worry, we'll spend a big chunk of time next week explaining this syntax in great detail. We're going to use a command called if, and then we'll say if mouse is pressed. Then we're going to open a curly bracket. The matching curly bracket will get automatically created. And then inside this if, we're going to change the color of the circle that we're drawing based on what's happening with my mouse button. Okay, so we'll say if the mouse is pressed, maybe we will draw a circle that has a black fill and a white stroke. Okay. And then else, right, if the mouse is not pressed, we're going to draw a circle that has the opposite color scheme. Let's go with a white fill and a black stroke. Okay. Again, I'm going over this syntax really quickly in this first lesson because I just want us to have a program working, and then we'll spend the next several lessons really unpacking this in great detail, explaining every little character and what their role is. So let's hit play here to run this program and see what the difference is. So the circle is still following the mouse, but now if I click the mouse, right, and keep my button pressed, I've changed the color scheme of the circle, and I can go back and forth between these two different patterns. Okay? So very fun. I mean, in essence, what we've done is created like a simple little drawing tool, right? And you could try to customize this based on your own ideas. In the next lesson, which we're going to go into in a second, we're going to talk about all the different other types of drawing commands that we have available at our disposal in p5.js, as well as everything that has to do with colors. So you'll be able to come back to this example and really kind of customize it, make it your own, and play with it a little bit. But before we do, I want to talk about a few other ideas before we wrap up this first video. So the first idea I want to talk about is, you may have noticed when I was writing lines of code here, not really explaining what I was doing, I was following a very specific formatting, right? I indented here, right? The function, I indented my if command, kind of a few lines here using the tab characters, a few spaces. I indented inside the if, the fill, the stroke. I'm adding some semicolon at the end of every line. So all of this formatting is just a way to make our code a little bit more readable. Okay? I do it as second nature now because I've been programming for a while. But the formatting in JavaScript is kind of it's not something that really bears meaning to the code. For example, I could choose to write my program like this, and it would still work, right? As long as my syntax is correct, as long as I'm not missing characters, I could write it like this, and then it would still work. Okay, but obviously this is really hard to read. So one thing that you can do in the beginning to help just help yourself with the syntax, because that's one of the hardest things learning how to program is really mastering that syntax, because every error to the syntax itself is a major stumbling block for the program, as we'll get into in a second. So one of the things that you can do to keep things clean and nice and tidy and easy to read without having to do it yourself is you can just write the code however you want, and then once in a while you can go under the edit menu and you can use this tidy code command here, which will automatically reformat the code for you. Just make it follow the correct conventions of indenting things and having the proper spacing and all that. So just one tip I want to throw out there. Now, we just talked about how the syntax is really important when we're programming. That's one of the biggest stumbling blocks. That's because the computer, right, the interpreter, is quite rigid, right? When it's trying to interpret this recipe, this program, it relies on us, the programmer, to make sure our syntax is correct. So what I mean by this is that, if we forget a parenthesis over here, right, accidentally delete it, right, we're going to get some errors. And these errors, when we're programming, they're going to appear down in this section at the bottom called the console. Okay? So here, sometimes these errors are not super helpful, right? Here, this saying unexpected token, curly bracket. So it means the program was going through what we wrote, and then it saw an open parenthesis, and then instead of seeing, it expected to see a closed parenthesis eventually, but then it ran into this open curly bracket and was just like, I don't know what to do, right? This is too much. So every little syntax errors will throw your program off. And in the beginning, that's the hardest part to learn, is getting familiar with the syntax. That's why we're going to take it slow, write basic programs where we can really focus on learning that syntax before we tackle more advanced ideas. So these errors will be down in the console, and it's your job as the programmer to kind of try to interpret this error message and then try to go and play detective in your code and find where you went wrong. Similarly, if you like misspell something, right here, I'm going to intentionally misspell circle. Sometimes the p5.js editor will actually have some helpful suggestions. Here it's saying circs is not defined, right? Which means in computer language terms, it says, I don't know what you're talking about. And there's a helpful suggestion here that says, oh, maybe you accidentally wrote this instead of circle, right? Maybe take a look. And in this case, that was my problem. So as you type, you will make errors. That's totally normal. Even advanced programmers make errors, and then you have to go back and find where you made a mistake. And the console here is going to be where we get all those error messages. Okay. And if you hit the clear button, you can get rid of what was written down there and then start the sketch again. And if your sketch starts up, then you're in a good place. Okay? So the console is we get these error messages. And then finally, before we wrap up this first lesson, I want to talk about now that you've written a sketch, right? What do you do with it? How do you share it? Maybe you've made something amazing. You want to share it with your friends, or maybe it's an assignment you want to hand in. You can go into the the file menu, and you can click on the share button. Okay. So if you click on share, you're going to get some options. This first link here, we're going to ignore. This would be if you wanted to take this program you've written and then embed it inside some other web page. We're going to ignore this, but we have two options here, right? We have something called the full screen version with a link, and then a link to the editor itself. Okay, so oops. So let's take a look at the difference. So if you click on this full screen link, and I'm going to open it in another tab here, you can see a version of your sketch, right, in all its glory, with just a little banner at the top here with a link pointing back to the editor version of the sketch. So every time you create a sketch on the p5.js editor, you can make it accessible to others by sharing the link. And you can also share the link to this version as well, which includes both the preview and the code. and it's very easy to go back and forth between these two. Okay? So I just wanted to point that out. So programs that you make, if you want to share them with others, you can do so just by getting a shareable link over here. Okay, I'm gonna hit save again just in case. And that concludes our first lesson, part 1. I will see you in part 2, where we're going to unpack this syntax a little bit more and expand our vocabulary of drawing and color commands. I'll see you there.